What you listening to, son?
Let's talk about the brain. There's a big reason why we're going to be talking about the brain and things related thereof. And that'll become more and more apparent as we get to the crescendo of this segment, okay? The brain is an organ that serves as the center of the nervous system in all vertebrate and most invertebrate animals. It is located in the head, usually close to the sensory organs for senses such as vision. It is the most complex organ in a vertebrate's body. In a human, the cerebral cortex contains approximately 14 to 16 billion neurons, which, if you need a reminder, is an electrically excitable cell that communicates with other cells via specialized connections called synapses. The neuron is the main component of nervous tissue in all animals except sponges and placozoa? Placozoa, yes. And the estimated number of neurons in the cerebellum is 55 to 70 billion. Each neuron is connected by synapses to several thousand other neurons. These neurons typically communicate with one another by means of long fibers called axons, which are also known as nerve fibers, which are long, slender projections of a nerve cell or neuron in vertebrates that typically conducts electrical impulses known as action potentials away from the nerve cell body. The function of the axon is to transmit information to different neurons, muscles, and glands, etc., which carry trains of signal pulses called action potentials. Yeah, we just went over that. Physiologically, brains exert centralized control over a body's other organs. They act on the rest of the body both by generating patterns of muscle activity and by driving the secretion of chemicals called hormones. This centralized control allows rapid and controlled responses to changes in the environment. Some basic types of responsiveness, such as reflexes, can be mediated by the spinal cord or peripheral ganglia. I thought of a stupid joke. You know how people be like ganglia. That's so stupid. I am fucking dumb. But sophisticated, purposeful control of behavior based on complex sensory input requires the information integrating capabilities of a centralized brain. The operations of individual brain cells are now understood in considerable detail, but the way they cooperate in ensembles of millions is yet to be solved. Recent models of modern neuroscience treat the brain as a biological computer, very different mechanism from an electronic computer, but similar in the sense that it acquires information from the surrounding world, stores it, and processes it in a variety of ways. Okay? Brain gang. Ganglia gang. So we know what a brain is. Some of our brains have wrinkles. Some of our brains are a little bit more smooth. But we all have a brain, okay? The hindbrain is the lower part of the brainstem comprising the cerebellum, pons, and medulla oblongata. What the fuck? Also called rhombencephalon. Rhombencephalon? Jesus, that's okay. A region of the developing vertebrate brain that is composed of the medulla oblongata, the pons, the cerebellum. The hindbrain coordinates functions that are fundamental to survival, including respiratory rhythm, motor activity, sleep, and wakefulness. It is one of the three major developmental divisions of the brain, the other two being the midbrain and the forebrain. Now, what is the midbrain? Also called mesencephalon, it is the region of the developing vertebrate brain that is composed of the tectum and tegmentum. The midbrain serves important functions in motor movement, particularly movements of the eye and in auditory visual processing. It is located within the brainstem. And between the other two developmental regions of the brain, the forebrain and the hindbrain, compared with those regions, the midbrain is relatively small. It's small brain, SMOL brain, small. Now, what is the forebrain? The forebrain is the anterior part of the brain, including the cerebral hemispheres, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. Also called the prosencephalon. It is the region of the developing vertebrate brain. It includes the telencephalon, which contains the cerebral hemispheres, and under these, the diencephalon, which contains thalamus, hypothalamus, epiphalamus, and subthalamus. I didn't know there were that many thalamuses. The forebrain plays a central role in the processing of information related to complex cognitive activities, sensory and associative functions, and voluntary motor activities. It represents one of the three major yada yada yada. The forebrain is also where the cerebral cortex is located, which is where a lot of your more abstract thought comes from, okay? Now, in the training that I had at work today, we were talking about these different types of the brain, okay? We were also talking about things such as implicit and explicit memory. We're going in a direction, don't worry. In psychology, implicit memory is one of the two main types of long-term human memory. It is acquired and used unconsciously and can affect thoughts and behaviors. One of its most common forms is procedural memory, which allows people to perform certain tasks without conscious awareness of these previous experiences. For example, remembering how to tie one's shoes or ride a bicycle without consciously thinking of those activities. Implicit memory, its counterpart, is known as explicit memory or declarative memory, which refers to the conscious, intentional recollection of factual information, previous experiences and concepts. Evidence for implicit memory arises in priming, a process whereby subjects are measured by how they have improved their performance on tasks for which they have been subconsciously prepared. Implicit memory also leads to the illusory truth effect, which suggests that subjects are more likely to rate as true those statements that they have already heard, regardless of their truthfulness. Interesting. It is the tendency to believe false information to be correct after repeated exposure. That is interesting. This phenomenon was first identified in a 1977 study at Villanova University and Temple University. Explicit memory or declarative memory is one of the two main types, yada, yada, yada. Explicit memory is the conscious, intentional recollection of factual information, previous experiences, and concepts. This type of memory is dependent upon three processes: acquisition, consolidation, and retrieval. Explicit memory can be divided into two categories: episodic memory, which stores specific personal experiences, and semantic memory, which stores factual information. Explicit memory requires gradual learning and multiple presentations of a stimulus and response. Now, let's make it clear. Implicit memory is like when you smell a certain kind of cologne and it reminds you of an old friend from middle school or high school or something. It reminds you of your dad, or or you smell a certain scent at a restaurant, like maybe they're deep frying some fries, and it reminds you of this date you were on 5 years ago that you completely forgot about, and the smell triggered that implicit memory that you didn't mean to remember, but it forced your memory to kick in, and now you remember that old date. So that's implicit memory. Explicit memory is basically, shit that we study, shit that we learn intentionally, things we recall when we were in school or university, things like this, or doing research like what I'm doing right now.
Hey, it's me, Destin. Welcome back to Smarter Every Day. You've heard people say it's just like riding a bike, meaning it's really easy and you can't forget how to do it, right? But I did something. I did something that damaged my mind. Where I work, the welders are geniuses and they like to play jokes on the engineers. He had a challenge for me. He had built a special bicycle and he wanted me to try to ride it. He had only changed one thing. When you turn the handlebar to the left, the wheel goes to the right. When you turn it to the right, the wheel goes to the left.
And here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Destin Sandlin. First attempt riding the bicycle.
So, the faster I go, the better.
Yeah.
I couldn't do it. You can see that I'm laughing, but I'm actually really frustrated. In this moment, I had a really deep revelation. My thinking was in a rut. This bike revealed a very deep truth to me. I had the knowledge of how to operate the bike, but I did not have the understanding. Therefore, knowledge is not understanding. Look, I know what you're probably thinking. Destin's probably just an uncoordinated engineer and can't do it. But that's not the case at all. The algorithm that's associated with riding a bike in your brain is just that complicated. Think about it. Downwards force on the pedals, leaning your whole body, pulling and pushing the handlebars, gyroscopic precession in the wheels. Every single force is part of this algorithm. And if you change any one part, it affects the entire control system. I do not make definitive statements that often, but I'm telling you right now, you cannot ride this bicycle. It's always the same. People think they're gonna try some trick or they're just gonna power through it. It doesn't work. Your brain cannot handle this. For instance, this guy, I offered him $200 just to ride this bike 10 feet across the stage. Everybody thought he could do it.
No, you didn't understand. You didn't understand. So, this way. All right, just a second. All right, so, whenever you're ready. Yeah. Wait. No, you have to keep your feet on. Dude, all right, here we go. Wait. Like, you gotta start rolling at least. Go. And go. Oh, go! All right, back up. Okay. Keep your feet on the pedal. Go. Go right off. Just keep your feet on the pedals. Handles on. Yeah, come on. All right, one more time.
Once you have a rigid way of thinking in your head, sometimes you cannot change that, even if you want to. So here's what I did. It was a personal challenge. I stayed out here in this driveway and I practiced about 5 minutes every day. My neighbors made fun of me. I had many wrecks, but after 8 months, this happened. One day I couldn't ride the bike and the next day I could. It was like I could feel some kind of pathway in my brain that was now unlocked. It was really weird though. It's like there's this trail in my brain, but if I wasn't paying close enough attention to it, my brain would easily lose that neural path and jump back onto the old road it was more familiar with. Any small distractions at all, like a cell phone ringing in my pocket, would instantly throw my brain back to the old control algorithm and I would wreck. But at least I could ride it. My son is the closest person to me genetically, and he's been riding a normal bike for 3 years. That's over half his life. I wanted to know how long it would take him to learn how to ride a backwards bike, so I told him if he learned how to ride a backwards bike, he could go with me to Australia and meet a real astronaut. Are you gonna give up?
No.
Go ahead. This is how it starts. Look at this. This is such a big deal. Get up, you got it.
Friends don't let friends play with inverted controls. True, absolutely.
Did you see his brain get it? So he, in, how many weeks have we been doing this? 2 weeks? In 2 weeks, he did something that took me 8 months to do, which demonstrates that a child has more neuroplasticity, am I even saying that right, than an adult.
As we will see in a second, this is why it's also very important to know that trauma in a child is absolutely fucking life-changing. And the more trauma that there is, the more likely it could get passed on.
It's backwards.
He's riding a regular
This was
bicycle
one of the most
now.
frustrating moments of my life. I had ridden a normal bike since I was 6, but in this moment, I couldn't do it anymore. I had set out to prove that I could free my brain from a cognitive bias. But at this point, I'm pretty sure that all I proved is that I could only redesignate that bias. So what you're not seeing is just a group of people here looking at me, looking at the strange American that can't ride a bike because they think I'm dumb. But I'm actually 2 levels deep into this because I've learned and unlearned. All right. After 20 minutes of making a fool out of myself, suddenly my brain clicked back into the old algorithm. I can't explain it, but it happened in a very specific moment. I got it. I'm back. Oh, it clicked. Hold it clicked. I got it. Okay, there it is. There was the moment. Okay, I can ride a bike. I tried to explain this to the people around me, and they just didn't get it. They thought I was faking the previous 20 minutes, and I couldn't get anybody to believe me. That looked like I faked that, didn't it?
Yeah. Just a face.
You think I'm faking. You don't believe me.
That looks so weird. You were like, la la la, and it's
You think I'm lying, don't you?
Yeah, I do.
I'm not lying. So I learned 3 things from this experiment. I learned that welders are often smarter than engineers. I learned that knowledge does not equal understanding. And I learned that truth is truth, no matter what I think about it. So be very careful how you interpret things, because you're looking at the world with a bias, whether you think you are or not.
So first of all, that last part is interesting. But generally speaking, yes, riding a bike the normal way is pretty intuitive. And so, of course, the backwards bike is going to be counterintuitive, and thus it's going to fuck you up. But, like, he was able to unlock a new neural pathway, right? Through practice and practice and practice, you know, as we all pretty much already know. How to ride a backwards bike, right? Use inverted controls, okay? There's a reason why we watch this, and there's a reason why I'm showing this. Okay? These are neural pathways over a certain period of time making new connections, okay? First of all, it's pretty. It really is. It's beautiful. And the fact that that's pretty much happening in your brain every single fucking day is truly mind-blowing. This is what it looks like to learn. Okay? However, not everything we learn is necessarily positive, now is it? Anthropologist Margaret Mead was asked by a student what she considered to be the first sign of civilization in a culture. Mead said that the first sign of civilization in an ancient culture was a femur or thigh bone that had been broken and then healed. Mead explained that in the animal kingdom, if you break your leg, you die. You cannot run from danger or get to the river for a drink of water or hunt for food. You are meat for prowling beasts. No animal survives a broken leg long enough for the bone to heal. Broken femur, a broken femur that is healed is evidence that someone has taken the time to stay with the one who fell, has bound up the wound, has carried the person to safety, and has tended to the person throughout recovery. Helping someone else through difficulty is where civilization starts. We are at our best when we serve others. Be civilized. How does trauma work? Trauma is the result of overloading the emotional circuits of the brain in the brain's control center. Chronic traumatic events follow overloads that damage the brain development, wiring, chemistry, and structure. Again, there is a point why we're going through all this. Mild trauma, normally I run my life in a conscious way that fits with how I know life works and who I am. These explanations are kept in my left brain and represent my reality. We would call them my accumulated God sight, because to me they are ultimate reality. The first loss of my brain synchronization under an increasing load of emotional energy happens when my explanations for how things work, stored in my left hemisphere, fail to account for intense emotions I am feeling. The first response from the control center in the right brain is to shut down the left brain and take over operations until my emotions have been quieted. Keep in mind that there is an area of the brain called Broca's area. I think that's what it's called, Broca's area. That's typically in the left side of the brain. So if the left side of your brain is under distress, you can't really use that, can you? We'll come back to that in a second. The right brain always tries to gather everything I know about feeling this way before it does what I have always done or seen done under these conditions. Moderate trauma. As trauma becomes more intense, the captain of the control center in the right prefrontal cortex discovers that I have never been in a mess this bad before. There is no example to follow to tell me what my people or I would do now. The control center begins to come apart, lose synchronization, and the mental banana at level 3 takes over to see if there is anyone who will share this distress with me. This middle level tries to establish a mutual mind state with anyone who seems to know how to handle this experience, looking for some kind of camaraderie, okay? Belonging. How long I will look for a mutual mind depends on many factors, including what I have learned, if I went through trauma before. Before long, my brain will select a preferred way to go through trauma if I have repeated incidents. When I can't wait anymore or the intensity of the emotions becomes too great, I will shut off and go into severe trauma. Severe trauma. If I lack enough capacity to handle the strength of my emotions, or there is no one to help me through sharing a mutual mind in my pain, I will turn off the mental banana at level 3, cingulate cortex, and with it, the front part of my mind. My left brain has been off for a while. My captain failed, so my control center began to come apart when the top level shut down, followed by the middle level, and now all the cortex that can be turned off has been turned off. I am no longer a relational being. I no longer think or act like a person. I do not distinguish people from objects, and I react in terror or rage. I am under the control of my level 2 amygdala, which is the fear response, right? The threat detection system. Some people might refer to that as the organic evidence of ego, which is not cortex and does not respond to my will or the desires of others. In the minutes, hours, and days following a severe trauma, I will try to find a mutual mind at level 3 to help me return to the world of relationships. If I fail to find a mutual mind, I will be bothered by intrusive thoughts and reactions to this experience when my cortex starts to run again. Profound trauma and then chronic trauma effects. Profound trauma, vegetative vagal? Parasympathetic shutdown. If my impersonal terror/rage condition lasts very long, I will completely shut down and become a vacant stare. This shutdown condition is called dissociation. While my brain continues to respond in minimal ways, I may no longer recognize that I am present or that these events are happening to me. If my brain is immature or my capacity is too small, I may not be able to consciously recall this experience when my cortex starts to run again, which is where sometimes some people will experience blackouts, or if they, it's a memory that they repress. You know, sometimes maybe in a therapeutic session, that psychologist, psychiatrist, therapist will hopefully safely bring back that repressed memory, and the patient, the client, will be able to face that, right? Chronic trauma effects will vary depending on how severe, frequent, and prolonged the traumatic events were, how much mutual mind, quote unquote, help I have received, and how weak my control center was due to immaturity or type B trauma. These factors will also determine how much physical damage was done to my control center by the trauma and how impaired my brain has become as a result. The general effects of trauma can be divided in two ways: right versus left and back versus front. Left and right, after trauma, the brain favors the right brain instead of the normal left side. This is because the mind struggles to control the intensity of feelings. This takes up way too much mental energy and keeps the control center on the right busy. People have difficulty concentrating, learning, and being productive. They tend to be moody, reactive, thin-skinned, and self-preoccupied. They may be very smart and still not live or react in ways that make sense, tending to make foolish choices when feelings are present or feelings are being avoided. Front and back. The front half of the brain is driven by desire and goals, while the back half is dominated by fear. The front half of the brain contains some of its more complex thinking and activity. I mentioned earlier, abstract thinking is pretty much what the forebrain, the cerebral cortex, is all about. While the back of the brain is more involved in processing basic data and solving simple problems. During trauma, the higher parts of the brain are shut down, as we have seen. One of the enduring effects of unresolved trauma is a dominance of the fear-driven back of the brain. Got it. Fear-driven people are anxious, hypervigilant, and avoidant. They do what it takes to get out of problems, real or imagined, and avoid whatever makes them unhappy or uncomfortable. Since they are not goal-directed, they are rarely far from the very feelings, events they fear, and often participate greatly in producing the very things they fear. Rationality versus irrationality. Rational fears versus irrational fears. Does it really matter? trauma will definitely produce the reality of both. How does trauma affect the brain, right? It can lead to a whole range of problems, including issues with memory, mood, sleep, ability to concentrate, reactions to triggers, physical health. The hippocampus is the part of the brain that is most affected by trauma. This is because the hippocampus is responsible for memory and learning. When a person experiences trauma, the hippocampus can be damaged. This can lead to problems with memory, concentration, and emotional regulation. The damage to the hippocampus can also make it difficult for a person to process new information. As a result, people who have experienced trauma may have difficulty forming new memories or may have trouble recalling existing memories. In addition, the damage to the hippocampus can make it difficult for a person to concentrate and focus on tasks. The hippocampus is a vital part of the brain, and when it is damaged by trauma, it can have a significant impact on a person's ability to function. What do they say about depression? I feel like there's almost a meme where people with issues with depression forget they have depression, you know, because what depression does is that it affects, it damages the brain to such an extent that you have memory loss. There have been some times where I have had depressive episodes, and at some point, like, whether it be through distractions or not, most of the time it's through distractions, I would temporarily kind of forget what made me upset in the first place. Depression is fucked up. It does a lot of fucked up shit. But that's not necessarily what this is about. Bruce Perry is a dude. He's a guy. I took some papers from the training I had at work, and there was a quote of his that I thought was very interesting. If I can find it, can I find it, is it even in, it's not even in here. Okay, all right, never mind. I am so well organized, let me tell you. Dr. Bruce Perry, MD, documents the brain science of how attachment problems can cause developmental trauma to a fetus, infant, or child just when the brain is developing. And he's taking his attachment first approach to Washington. And trauma impacts the brain, healing happens in relationships. Perry leads a full day pre-conference university on Sunday, May 4th, yada, yada, yada. Experiences profoundly influence the development of young children. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, shape the brain's organization, which in turn influences the emotional, social, cognitive, and physiological activities. So often, trauma happens in relationships, but it is also in relationships that healing occurs. Explore the latest research and yada, yada, yada. So he has this thing called relationship and attachment theory, healing model, neurosequential model of therapeutics. That's the official name of it. So let's see here. So let's check out his model real quick. Okay, so there's the cortex. Oh, interesting. Cortex is associated with guilt and shame, abstract thought, concrete thought, affiliation, reward, attachment, limbic, alcohol and substance abuse, attachment, sexual behavior, emotional reactivity, diencephalon cerebellum, depressive and affect symptoms, motor regulation, arousal, appetite. Okay, so this is basically going down the hierarchy of needs, the further down into the core of the brain that we're looking at. And brainstem is next, trauma core symptoms, which can physically affect you, okay? I am not listening to that. This is where it starts getting interesting for me, okay? And this is the direction that I was wanting to take it, okay? How trauma can be passed down. Trauma can start in the womb. A growing and developing fetus is completely dependent upon the mother within whom it resides. Attached by the umbilical cord, a fetus receives air, food, water, and whatever else a mother digests. which is why a mother who abuses drugs or alcohol does a great deal of damage to her offspring. Sustenance and chemical input are not the only things a fetus receives from their mother. The fetus is also extremely sensitive to how a mother is feeling emotionally. What is going on in her internal environment, as well as what is happening in her external environment. Just as born individuals are affected by everything they experience in life, the budding life form of a fetus is already being impacted by everything they are experiencing, though they aren't grown yet. Trauma doesn't necessarily have to occur to the mother for it to occur to the fetus. In the traditional idea of trauma, guilt, shame, stress, and toxic emotional trauma can and often does compute into the growing fetus's genetic makeup. Without a say or an ability to contest, emotionally traumatic experiences are transmitted to the fetus and coded into the very fiber of their being. Paul Thompson wrote about trauma in the womb for Birth Psychology. Early pre- and postnatal experiences, including early trauma, are encoded in the implicit memory, remember we talked about that earlier, of the fetus, located in the subcortical and deep limbic regions of the maturing brain. Much research has been found that the limbic system, when interrupted during early developmental stages, can contribute to PTSD and mental health problems later in life, as it is a region for emotional regulation. These memories will travel with us into our early days of infancy and beyond, and more importantly, she explains, these early experiences set our ongoing physiological and psychological regulatory baselines, meaning the experiences we have in the womb already start to set the course for how our bodies and our minds will respond to the world once we're born. And then these can be experienced in utero. Arguments, verbal stress, emotional stress, chaos in the home environment, alcoholism, drug addiction, guilt, shame, physical abuse, poor health, neglect. And let's be honest, a lot of trauma can be internally originated, but let's be quite frank, our environment tends to cause a lot of these things most of the time. And so, if there happens to be a long time of trauma passed on, there's going to be a result, no matter how long it's been going on. How parents' trauma leaves biological traces in children. After the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center collapsed on September 11, 2001, in a haze of horror and smoke, clinicians at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in Manhattan offered to check anyone who'd been in the area for exposure to toxins. Among those who came in for evaluation were 187 pregnant women. Many were in shock. And a colleague asked if I could help diagnose and monitor them. They were at risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, experiencing flashbacks, nightmares, emotional numbness, and other psychiatric symptoms for years afterwards. And were the fetuses at risk? My trauma research team quickly trained health professionals to evaluate and, if needed, treat the women. We monitored them through their pregnancies and beyond. When the babies were born, they were smaller than usual. The first sign that the trauma of the World Trade Center attack had reached the womb. 9 months later, we examined 38 women and their infants when they came in for a wellness visit. Psychological evaluations revealed that many of the mothers had developed PTSD, and those with PTSD had unusually low levels of the stress-related hormone cortisol, a feature that researchers were coming to associate with the disorder. Surprisingly and disturbingly, the saliva of the 9-month-old babes of the women with PTSD also showed low cortisol. So we're starting to see how this shit passes on physiologically and physically. The effect was most prominent in babies whose mothers had been in their 3rd trimester on that fateful day. Just a year earlier, a team I led had reported low cortisol rate levels in adult children of Holocaust survivors. But we'd assumed that it had something to do with them being raised by parents who were suffering from the long-term emotional consequences of severe trauma. Now it looks like trauma leaves a trace in offspring even before they are born. In the decades since, research by my group and others have confirmed that adverse experiences may influence the next generation through multiple pathways. The most apparent route runs through parental behavior, but influences during gestation and even changes in eggs and sperm may also play a role. And all these channels seem to involve epigenetics, alterations in the way that genes function. Epigenetics potentially explains why effects of trauma may endure long after the immediate threat is gone. And it is also implicated in the diverse pathways by which trauma is transmitted to future generations. So real quick, to help you identify what trauma looks like in daily life, here's a list of some of the most common emotional and physical symptoms of trauma. Denial of the traumatic event or events, developing numbness to the trauma, detaching emotions from thoughts and actions, extreme anger or sadness, emotional outbursts, experiencing shame as a response to the trauma, somatic symptoms, physical responses like shaking, sleep problems, and insomnia, breathing problems. And we can see those here still. Gastrointestinal problems, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disorders, substance abuse disorders, development of PTSD. Okay? Symptoms of PTSD, flashbacks or reliving the traumatic event for minutes or even days at a time. Shame or guilt, upsetting dreams about the traumatic event. Trying to avoid thinking or talking about the traumatic event, feeling emotionally numb, irritability or anger, poor relationships, self-destructive behavior such as drinking too much or drugs, hopelessness about the future, trouble sleeping, memory problems, trouble concentrating, being easily startled or frightened, not enjoying activities you once enjoyed, hearing or seeing things that aren't there. And these are also different stages of life: preschool, elementary, middle, and high school. Preschool children feeling helpless and uncertain, fear of being separated from their parent or caregiver, cry and or scream a lot, eat poorly, lose weight, return to bedwetting, return to using baby talk, develop new fears, having nightmares, recreating the trauma through play, are not developing to the stage to the next growth stage. Changes in behavior, asking questions about death. Elementary school children becoming anxious and fearful, worry about their own or others' safety, becoming clingy with a teacher or a parent, guilt and shame. Telling others about the traumatic event again and again, becoming upset if they get a small bump or bruise. Have a hard time concentrating, experience numbness, have fears that the event will happen again, having difficulty sleeping. I wish I could see what that says. Oh, there we go. Show changes in school performance, becoming easily startled. Now, middle and high school, feeling depression and loneliness. Discuss the traumatic events in detail. Develop eating disorders and self-harming behaviors such as cutting. Trigger warning, by the way. Sorry. Start using or abusing alcohol and or drugs, becoming sexually active, feel like they're going crazy, feel different from everyone else, lack of belonging, right? Take too many risks, have sleep disturbances, don't want to go to places that remind them of the event, say they have no feeling about the event, and then general changes in behavior. The amygdala. Trauma can change your brain on many levels, from the way you make decisions down to your immediate subconscious responses to the world around you. Part of the reason it can be so hard to overcome the effects of trauma is that it goes after several areas of your brain at once. According to a 2006 study by NIH, trauma mainly affects three important parts of your brain: the amygdala, which is your emotional and instinctual center; the hippocampus, which we discussed earlier, which controls memory; and the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for regulating your emotions and impulses. All three parts work together to manage stress. When you're reminded of a traumatic experience, your amygdala, emotional and survival center, goes into overdrive. acting just as it would if you were experiencing that trauma for the first time. Your prefrontal cortex also becomes suppressed, so you're less capable of controlling your fear. You're stuck in a purely reactive state. Meanwhile, trauma also leads to reduced activity in the hippocampus, one of whose functions is to distinguish between past and present, memory. In other words, your brain can't tell the difference between the actual traumatic event and the memory of it. It perceives things that trigger memories of traumatic events as threats themselves. Trauma can cause your brain to remain in a state of hypervigilance, suppressing your memory and impulse control and trapping you in a constant state of strong emotional activity, the constant, I need to protect me and what's mine mode, survival mode. Changes to the amygdala from trauma. The amygdala is the emotional response center of the brain that helps people perceive and control their emotions. It also plays a role in emotional memories and fear response. When someone experiences a traumatic event and is showing signs of PTSD, their amygdala often becomes more active than it normally would. Studies have continuously found that the amygdala of someone with PTSD has increased function in response to stimuli that remind them of their trauma or other fear-related stimuli. Not surprisingly, people with PTSD often have greater fear responses, and this research suggests that it may be a result of these changes in the amygdala. And what about the hippocampus? Primarily with memory and learning, brain scans have shown that the hippocampus has decreased function in people with PTSD when they are exposed to something that reminds them of trauma. Not only is the function of the hippocampus affected by trauma, but also the structure may change as well, depending on how severely the person's been affected by their trauma. Those with PTSD were found to have significantly smaller hippocampi than those who were exposed to trauma but not experiencing PTSD. And then last but not least, the prefrontal cortex. It's the part of the brain that is responsible for executive functioning or higher level thinking and reasoning. Again, abstract thought, problem solving, those kinds of things. People with PTSD have been found to have decreased function and activation of the prefrontal cortex when exposed to traumatic reminders. This may account for any irrational fears or rational that trauma victims may have trouble overcoming, whether subtle or significant. Trauma changes the brain in several ways and can lead to lasting negative effects. The best way to overcome these challenges is to find a trauma treatment center that can help address these issues and possibly reverse some of those effects. I can hear you right now asking me, why are we talking so much about trauma? Why are we talking so much about childhood stages of trauma and the fact that it can be passed on from mother to womb to fetus to child? Why are we talking about this? What's the point? We'll get to that in a second after looking at Dr. Roch's brain scans. This one in particular is a normal brain, okay? Broca's area right here, okay? If you are going through a traumatic experience, okay, or you're recalling a traumatic experience, that shuts off, as you can see by the other three scans right here. Traumatic minus neutral, okay, minus neutral, traumatic minus teeth clenching, neutral minus traumatic. So this is a healthy brain, okay? These three scans right here all have some form of trauma, and all three of them have the same characteristic. Their Broca's area is not lit up. There is no activity in their Broca's area. If I am going through a traumatic emotional upheaval of really any sort, my Broca's area is going to shut off. And guess what? You ask me what question? What's wrong, Greyecraft? What's wrong? I can't. You can't explain what's happening with you. That's the job of the Broca's area. Basically, this is where emotional logic, if you will, kind of comes from. By the way, I'm not a fucking doctor. I'd like to make that clear right now. That's basically what that is. It helps to kind of regulate, in the most amateur of terms, your sanity during emotional upheavals in your life. A region in the frontal lobe of the dominant hemisphere, usually the left, sometimes the right side, of the brain with functions linked to speech production. This is the other interesting thing. Language processing has been linked to Broca's area since Pierre-Paul Broca reported impairments in 2 patients. They had lost the ability to speak after injury to the posterior inferior frontal gyrus of the brain. Since then, the approximate region he identified has become known as Broca's area, and the deficient in language production as Broca's aphasia, which is an ability to comprehend or formulate language because of the damage to specific brain regions. This is also why some people develop speech impediments or stutters. If there's a damage to the Broca's area, they'll end up developing something like this. Broca's area is now typically defined in terms of pars opercularis or triangularis of the inferior frontal gyrus. Chronic aphasia have implicated an essential role of Broca's area in various speech and language functions. Further fMRI studies have also identified activation patterns in Broca's area associated with various language tasks. However, slow destruction of Broca's area by brain tumors can leave speech relatively intact, suggesting its functions can shift to nearby areas of the brain. That's interesting. Huh. These are 2 separate brain scans. This is a healthy brain that has not been abused or neglected. These are 11-year-olds, by the way. Both of them are 11-year-old boys. This brain has not been subjected to any severe abuse or neglect or trauma of any sort, as far as we know. And this one has. I forget what these are right here, but these are definitely not supposed to be this. But this right here is the amygdala. Okay, the fear response part of the brain. As you can see, huge fucking difference right here. Okay, so they are constantly in fight, flight, or freeze mode. Constantly. So if we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, okay, pretty much as much fulfillment throughout all of these as much as possible will decrease any chance of trauma, at least mostly, maybe not guaranteed, but pretty much. The physiological, the base human necessities for survival: breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis, excretion. And then safety, security, body, employment, resources, morality, the family, health, property, okay, which goes into love and belonging, friendship, family, sexual intimacy, love, esteem, self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of others, respect by others, pride in yourself, and pride from those you care about the most. And then self-actualization, fulfillment, morality, creativity, spontaneity, problem solving, lack of prejudice, acceptance of facts. There's a couple different forms of this. Passions, there's a couple different that might vary in a word or two, but it's pretty much through and through the same. Fulfillment of all these things is pretty much going to be a guarantee. The highest chance of the biggest decrease of the likelihood of experiencing trauma, which, as we have seen plenty of scientific data, okay, and some experiences of professionals in the field, or more accurately, of having a healthy, efficient, emotionally stable, and undamaged brain, and thus having a fulfilling human experience. This does not guarantee that you will be devoid of trauma in life. I worded that incorrectly, but rather you will be of sound mind and have a more balanced and capable approach to dealing with traumatic events, not if, but when they will inevitably occur, where unfortunately, and ironically enough, those afflicted with trauma, especially the more debilitating forms of it, may have more difficulty overcoming the then manifested effects of said trauma in external life, reflecting one's internal broken reality, further solidifying the trauma and further divorcing the victim from attaining actualization, an effective antidote to that very trauma, keeping them from actualization in the first place. It's a vicious cycle of suffering. Having a healthy brain is not the key. It's just a shield. Trauma leads to really fucked up and not good of times. There's not really a healthy way to go about the world when you have a life riddled with and impacted by trauma. Okay? This is pretty much a no-brainer, but it's important to point this out. Okay? Let's get through this, and then we're going to get into the real stuff. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is an idea in psychology proposed by American psychologist Abraham Maslow. In his 1943 paper, A Theory of Human Motivation, Maslow subsequently extended the idea to include his observation of humans' innate curiosity. His theories parallel many other theories of human developmental psychology, some of which focus on describing the stages of growth in humans. The theory is a classification system intended to reflect the universal needs of society, needs of society at its base, then proceeding to more acquired emotions. The hierarchy of needs is split between deficiency needs and growth needs, with two key themes involved within the theory, being individualism and the prioritization of needs. While the theory is usually shown as a pyramid in illustrations, Maslow himself never created a pyramid to represent the hierarchy of needs. The hierarchy of needs is a psychological idea and also an assessment tool, particularly in education, healthcare, and social work. The hierarchy remains a popular framework in sociology research, including management training and higher education. Moreover, the hierarchy of needs is used to study how humans intrinsically partake in behavioral motivation. Maslow used the terms psychological safety, belonging and love, social needs or esteem, self-actualization, and transcendence to describe the pattern through which human needs and motivations generally move. This means that, according to the theory, for motivation to arise at the next stage, each prior stage must be satisfied by an individual. The hierarchy has been used to explain how effort and motivation are correlated in the context of human behavior. Each of these individual levels contains a certain amount of internal sensation that must be met in order for an individual to complete their hierarchy. The goal in Maslow's hierarchy is to attain the level or stage of self-actualization. Okay? So that's pretty much the pinnacle, right? It starts from here and goes on up through here, as we can see. Okay, now this bottom going up, at least metaphorically, but baseline to most abstract, fulfillment of these things is the pinnacle of what human beings desire and need in order to feel complete, to be whole. I would like to think that completeness, wholeness, actualization is the perfect antidote, or at least as near perfect as we possibly can conceive of right now, or at least that I can conceive of, to combating the opposite of these things, which tend to arise from, what have we been discussing? Trauma. Remember that the amygdala is the center of the brain that is responsible for fear response and threat detection. We're not going to get into it too much because we already have in a previous video that you can find on my YouTube. But these papers right here, by Current Biology, explains to a mind-boggling degree the difference between liberals and conservatives, left-leaning and right-leaning people, in terms of the amygdala. Basically, the more liberal a person is, the, I guess, smaller or less impacted, less damaged their amygdala is. The more right-leaning, the more conservative the brain is. Not even just the person, the brain. We're talking about the brain. That this is basically what makes someone liberal or conservative to a certain extent. To a certain extent. There are different factors. But a big contribution is the size of one's amygdala in the brain. Conservatives have a larger amygdala, a larger center of fear response and of threat detection. Which explains a fucking lot, doesn't it? What's transgenerational trauma? Transgenerational trauma is the psychological and physiological effects that the trauma experienced by people has on subsequent generations in that group. There are two types of transmission. Intergenerational transmission, where epigenetic changes are passed down from the directly traumatized generation to their offspring. And transgenerational trauma transmission, when the offspring then passes it down to their offspring, who have not been exposed to the initial traumatic event. Collective trauma is when psychological trauma, and this is a great fucking example. Collective trauma is when psychological trauma experienced by communities and identity groups is carried on as part of the group's collective memory and shared sense of identity. For example, collective trauma was experienced by Jewish Holocaust survivors and other groups of the Jewish community at the time, and by the Indigenous peoples of Canada during the Canadian Indian residential school system. When this collective trauma affects subsequent generations, it is called transgenerational trauma. For example, if Jewish people experience extreme stress or practice survivalism out of fear of another Holocaust, despite being born after the Holocaust, they then are experiencing transgenerational trauma. Transgenerational trauma can also can be a collective experience that affects groups of people who share a cultural identity, such as ethnicity, nationality, religious identity. It can also be applied to single families or individual parent-child dyads. For example, survivors of individual child abuse, and both direct survivors of the collective trauma and members of subsequent generations individually may develop complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The mechanism for transmission of trauma may be via epigenetic modifications induced by stress. This is a novel area of research, and given the complexity of issues surrounding the trauma and the human experience, the relative contributions of epigenetics and cultural and social factors will be challenging to elucidate. Examples of this include collective trauma experienced by descendants of the Atlantic slave trade, segregation and Jim Crow laws in the United States, apartheid in South Africa, the colonization of African countries, Jewish Holocaust survivors and other members of the Jewish community at that time, by the First Peoples of Canada during the Canadian Indian residential school system, and in Australia, the stolen generations and other hardships inflicted by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Descendants of survivors may experience extreme stress leading to a variety of other consequences. Motherfucking boom. I want everyone to know right now that when I make this a video, this isn't for you. This is for conservatives. Is there any hope of convincing them? I don't know. I'm not really holding my breath, to be quite frank. But for fuck's sake, when you have all of this information, including what we just read, you still think reparations is bullshit? What, you think that's just left the past now? We got over it. Civil Rights Act was passed suddenly. suddenly, racism is over, right? After all of this research, after all of these different points and references, after all these different definitions of words, going into brain chemistry, going into how trauma works, how different parts of the brain are affected and how they function, again, going over what transgenerational trauma is, which is something that you could probably find in the DSM-5. 400 years. Imagine 400 fucking years of transgenerational trauma, of trauma passed on to trauma, passed on to trauma, over and over and over again. I was just in a voice chat the other night. I'm not going to say who all was involved in the call. I'm not going to get into detail. That's too personal for that. But I'm just going to say, to hear some of the stories of some of my friends talking about their older relatives who might have experienced some trauma that turned into transgenerational is mind-boggling, because guess what? When I look in the fucking mirror, that doesn't occur to me. And you, the conservative, it doesn't occur to you. I literally pulled up all of this shit. In less than an hour. Let me ask you something. Conservative. All conservatives that potentially watch this. Do you have an hour of your day that you could take out? Just one. 1 hour. To read shit like this. Yes. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not even this week or this month. But at some point, you got a fucking hour. Your fucking wife took your kids to soccer or whatever the fuck, to baseball practice or some shit. You took some vacation days off work. You got the house to yourself. You're pop opening a beer. Maybe the boys canceled out on football night. You got an hour to look into everything we just pulled up here. All scientific data. Proven that black people need reparations, motherfucker. I mean, for fuck's sake, what, you just think that that history is just the past? The sentence I just said, history is just the past, is now in the past just 15 seconds ago. These are all constructs. Okay, it's just one big now. So 400 years ago, a crazy fucking amount of trauma happens. You don't think it's going to affect people today? What I just gave you was the brain chemistry version of critical race theory, motherfucker. That's what I just gave you. That's what just happened. It's not that hard to understand. This is no fucking joke. This is not something to scoff at. They had the fucking the underground fucking railroad. Like, come the fuck on, dude. How traumatic do you think this shit was? Look it up. Just, how about this? I got an idea. I'll go at, okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds. It took me to pull up the underground fucking railroad. Look this shit up, pussy. Then we got something called the Insurrection Act of 1807. I brought this up several times in regards to Donald Trump. As a matter of fact, let's look at what the fuck he said.
If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
President Trump's remarks followed days of protests across the country over the deadly arrest of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Floyd, a black man, died last Monday after a white Minneapolis police officer pressed a knee into his neck. Some of the protests have been marked with violence, looting, and fires.
I am mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military, to stop the rioting and looting, to end the destruction and arson, and to protect the rights of law-abiding Americans, including your Second Amendment rights.
The Insurrection Act was most recently invoked during the 1992 Los Angeles riots and during Hurricane Hugo in 1989. According to CNN, President Trump's remarks have left some Pentagon officials deeply wary. The outlet reports that some officials have tried to respond with strong cases as to why the deployment of active military troops is not yet warranted unless requested by state governors. There is debate surrounding whether President Trump can legally deploy active U.S. troops to the cities under this act without the request from state governments. Governors such as Illinois' J.B. Pritzker are already pushing back on President Trump's comments.
Do we remember this? The Insurrection Act has been invoked throughout American history. In the 19th century, it was invoked during conflicts with the Native Americans. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was invoked during labor conflicts. Later in the 20th century, it was used to enforce federally mandated desegregation. Oh, okay. Presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy invoking the act in opposition to the affected states' political leaders to enforce court-ordered desegregation. More recently, governors have requested and received support following looting in the aftermath of Hurricane Hugo. And yeah, she already said that. George W. Bush considered intervening during Hurricane Katrina with this. And then June 1st, 2020, Donald Trump warned that he would invoke the act in response to the George Floyd protests following the murder of George Floyd. In his statement, Trump urged every governor to deploy the National Guard in sufficient numbers to reestablish civil law and order until the violence has been quelled. This was in response to Native Americans defending their fucking land and their fellow tribes people against white-ass motherfuckers coming in to completely fucking slaughter them. It was invoked to catch runaway slaves and quell slave rebellions. Black Lives Matter, after 400 fucking years of transgenerational trauma, decides to invoke this.
Because this is what the president says he has the right to use to deploy what he calls thousands and thousands of military troops here domestically in the United States. I'll read the act. The Insurrection Act of 1807 is a United States federal law that governs the ability of the President of the United States to deploy military troops within the United States to suppress civil disorder, insurrection, and rebellion. So that's the law the president is citing. That's why you're seeing these military police on the streets right near the White House, right over at Lafayette Park.
I think it's important when we talk about the president's authority to draw a distinction here. The president basically has carte blanche to bring the military into the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia is not a state, and the president can bring in the military if he likes. It's a very different story in the 50 states.
And yet conservatives are always doing what? They're always citing the Declaration of Independence, where it says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute a new government, right? They always want to fucking cite this when their Second Amendment rights are being threatened. But when, black people are being systemically killed off by cops and no one's doing fucking dick about it, you're being rebellious or being insurrectionist.
No one ever went broke appealing to the ignorance of white people. The collaborator treating non-white suffering as the cost of doing business also works rhetorically. The average conservative citizen doesn't know anything about the Syrian civil war, but they know the refugee crisis is something the left seems to care about. So demonizing refugees is mutually beneficial for pundits and politicians who want to rally their base by spiting liberals. and for white supremacists who want to mainstream racism against Arabs. The average conservative citizen doesn't understand epidemiology, but they don't want to blame their own party for letting 1 million die of COVID, so calling it the Chinese virus is mutually beneficial for pundits and politicians who want to deflect blame onto a foreign nation, and for white supremacists who want to mainstream racism against Asians. And yet, despite this blatancy in collaborating with white supremacists and having eerily similar goals to white supremacists, the collaborator insists that they are themselves non-racist. Their decades of opposing affirmative action, right to assembly, police reform, fair voting efforts, redistricting, funding for public schools, prisoners' rights, religious tolerance, shutting down Guantanamo, accessibility for non-English speakers, immigration, investment in low-income neighborhoods, decolonizing school curricula, Indigenous Peoples Day, putting Harriet Tubman on the 20, kneeling, ending the drug war, or withdrawing from the Middle East, are framed as problems of implementation. We agree with the aim of closing the racial wealth gap, just not like this. We agree with the aim of Latin Americans entering the country, just not like this. We agree with the aim of peaceful protest, just not like this. And if we on the left are to ask, how exactly are we supposed to get this without this? Oh, coming up with that solution? That's our job. And if it's not getting done, it's because we haven't come up with a solution they like yet. And probably what they don't like about our solutions is that we implied the problem was racism. Yes, white people are overrepresented in dozens of industries nationwide, but have you considered that it's a fluke? Pitch me a solution for it being a fluke. The collaborators' white supremacy exists in the negative space. They agree racism exists. They agree we should oppose it. But they disagree that any individual thing you're talking about is an example of it. Getting a Republican to identify an actual incident of systemic racism is like trying to point at your shadow with a flashlight.
400 years of not like this. Not like this. Not like this. No, not like that. Not like this. No, stop. Not like that. I, unfortunately, was, during my breaks, when I was at work today, on my day off, for a mandatory training, that I got extra hours on, so extra pay, cool. Was arguing with someone on Twitter, which is continuously descending into the very hellscape that Elon Musk said it wouldn't become, with conservatives who are getting really fucking triggered by the very first transgender elected official. I'll take national divorce for 1,000, Alex. To which I said, if you don't like it here, you can leave. Which is a direct quote from Donald fucking Trump himself. Quoting the great man still doesn't help make you look smart. Just saying, oh, and have a lovely racist day, racist. What? First of all, try English, motherfucker. Trump threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act of 1807, originally drafted to quell slave rebellions and catch runaway slaves, in response to Black Lives Matter, but I'm somehow racist. Okay, buddy. Threatening ain't doing now, is it? Which is a dumb fucking argument. Out of 10,000 protests through 2020, less than 3% of them turned into riots, and half of those were incited by law enforcement and not protesters. And burning a few buildings is not burning cities. Proportionality matters. If I threatened you with a loaded gun in your face, would it matter to you if I didn't pull the trigger? Threats aren't doing, but it doesn't fucking matter, and the threat was racist, and would have affected a large enough amount of black people that it would constitute a genocide. To which this dumb fuck says, did you forget about the 17 deaths and the billions in damage and looting, burned federal buildings, Democrat? Question mark, we haven't forgot. Thank you. There must be something wrong with, like, their brain function, probably outside of them having an enlarged amygdala because they can't fucking type. To which I responded, have you forgotten all the times that black people peacefully protested before 2020 by, say, kneeling in a football game or chanting, I can't breathe in front of courthouses? But your side, every single goddamn time, insisted that they weren't protesting right. Maybe it was the inevitable outcome of an entire demographic of people not being heard or having their grievances properly addressed. I'm not going to condone the violence and the mayhem that happened, but the problem here is the willful lack of understanding where these riots burst from and why they happened. In my field, dealing with drug addicts and alcoholics with severe trauma issues, I can assure you that they did not originate out of a vacuum. Those riots were 100% provoked. And the ignorance on the right as to how trauma or transgenerational trauma works is on full display. There's a story about a guy who was serving life in prison for murdering his mom and stepdad at the age of 15. But if you knew what led up to that, you would understand why he did it. Maybe even borderline justify it. Trauma is a key factor to consider, but when it's black people leading a global movement for social justice, nah. They just need to lift themselves up by their bootstraps. Racism is over, and I won't open my mind anything further than what my bias will allow me to consider. It's bullshit. It's immature, it's unfair, it's devoid of compassion and empathy. If I am supposedly not describing you, you're not giving any good reason for me to believe that this isn't you and the rest of the right wing. Your actions and rhetoric says it all. This is ultimately on you, conservatives. To which they said, call bullshit on those statistics. Okay, but like based on what? Why? Because they're controlled by Jews? I'm sorry, the globalists. The globalists, that's the new word. What insane rationale could you possibly employ so as to, with contempt prior to any investigation, just automatically conclude that those statistics are bullshit? You don't have any evidence to back such a monumentally wrong fucking claim. And now he's trying to deflect, saying, oh, you are racist. Now it's the Jews you were identifying. This is dumb. It's dumb. The conservative mind is not healthy. It's not, and to be quite frank with you, the higher mind within me, the version of me, the best version of me, almost wants to say that conservatism is a byproduct of trauma. And that's why you're fucked up. Because you refuse to get any fucking therapy. You'd rather blame all your fucking problems on brown people and say shit like when the looting starts, the shooting starts, like your Fuhrer fucking did, instead of just going to get a fucking a psychiatrist appointment and get on some fucking meds. You'd rather point the finger at everybody else but not look at the three pointing back. Conservatives, you guys have no fucking clue how much, ironically enough and unironically enough, everything you complain about, you bring upon your fucking selves. You are the source of the problems you guys are complaining about. And you're too cognitively fucking deficient with your cognitive dissonance, with your willful ignorance, and your arrogance and your pride in your willful ignorance to try and solve it coherently. It's insane to me that you can't consider the potential source of the very things that you're saying is destroying the country. Quote unquote, burning down cities when it's just like 3 buildings.
Jesus! How far can these guys push the envelope before the rest of the establishment calls them what they are? But if you're waiting for the moment a white moderate agrees mainstream conservatism has done something unacceptably and unequivocally racist, you're underestimating how long white people can equivocate. POC representation is quickly reframed as a critical long-term goal, but in the present moment, while we are competing for elected office, guaranteeing the minority vote is a luxury. What's prioritized is that the people who suppressed the black vote in order to win elections not be made to feel that they are racist. Because, I mean, What if they genuinely believe the Voting Rights Act unfairly targets southern states? Or even if, and I'm saying if here, they did do it to suppress votes. If hurting black people isn't their goal and they're just trying to win elections, is that really racist? See, there's this other definition of racism that most white people learn in grade school. Racism is when you say mean things to other kids about skin color and it hurts their feelings. Racism is about cruelty, and harm done by white people, therefore, is not racism if it isn't cruel, if it's merely ignorant or apathetic. But ignorance and apathy can be reasoned with. You just gotta sit down and hash it out, as long as it takes. Real white supremacy is about emotional distress or interpersonal violence. It's uncommon, it's unpopular, and it's a hearts and minds issue. What this definition leaves out is any notion that white supremacy is about power.
Now what I'm saying is this. I would like for all of us to believe in nonviolence, but I'm here to say tonight that if every Negro in the United States turns against nonviolence, I'm going to stand up as a lone voice and say this is the wrong way.
I will never change in my basic idea that nonviolence is the most potent weapon available to the Negro in his struggle for freedom and justice. I think for the Negro to turn to violence would be both impractical and immoral.
There is an increasingly vocal minority who disagreed totally with your tactics, Dr. King.
There's no doubt about that. I will agree that there is a group in the Negro community advocating violence now. I happen to feel that this group represents a numerical minority. Surveys have revealed this. The vast majority of Negroes still feel that the best way to deal with the dilemma that we face in this country is through nonviolent resistance. And I don't think this vocal group will be able to make a real dent in the Negro community in terms of swaying 22 million Negroes to this particular point of view. And I contend that the cry of black power is at bottom a reaction to the reluctance of white power to make the kind of changes necessary to make justice a reality for the Negro. I think we've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard.
Oh, what? What was that? I'm sorry. Conservatives, perk your ears up real quick.
A riot is the language of the unheard. We've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard. We've got to see that a riot is the language of the unheard.
When you have a shitty little brat, okay, let's say your kid is being a piece of shit, all right, and just kicking and screaming and shit. What, you think he's just being a little shit for no reason? He's crying out for attention. He needs something. She. They. If your child is acting out, it's pretty much common knowledge at this point that that child has needs that aren't being met. There are things that your kid needs that you are at least at that moment, not providing. I don't know about you, but I am under the theory that there's no such thing as adults. Grown-ups, completely made up. They're not real. We're all kids. From cradle to fucking grave, we're kids. We're constantly learning. We're constantly changing. We're constantly evolving. Some of us more so than others. And that ultimately, conversations that we have, especially when we vocalize things that we need or that we want done, ambitions, aspirations, arguments. They are all evolved manifestations of wah! Wah! Baby crying out for help. Hold me, feed me, love me. But when it's black people, fuck them, right? When it's brown people, fuck them, right? What I'm saying here, and I really am not trying to be an asshole. I'm really trying to send a very important message to the conservative. Look in the fucking mirror. Do some fucking reflection. And understand that maybe, there's something on your part that needs to be done. Okay? Humility, as defined, is a modest or low view of one's own importance. Can be used to describe what is ranked low by others, as in persons of humble origins. People also use the word on themselves and things associated with themselves. If you describe yourself as but a humble editor, or refer to your home as your humble abode, you are saying that neither you nor your home is very impressive. It's the opposite of boasting. It's the opposite of ego. Humility. I will continue to say this motto. The truth does not require my approval, my permission, or my belief in it for it to be the truth. It is 100% possible that I am right. It is 100% possible that I am wrong. They are both equal. Consider that maybe it's not every single fucking time always just the former. What if you're wrong? And what if there are people who desperately need help? 400 years worth of help? And probably just as long as black people. Many decades, if not centuries, of help from the transgender community. Who just needs you to just do a fucking Google search, bro. Equipped with some humility.
White people who disavow racism still live longer, get paid better, get arrested less often, and are typically in position to negotiate with whomever's in power. That this society was built for the everyman, and being the everyman confers power upon you. When children of white moderates get older and first brush up against this definition, wherein white supremacy is not small, but all-encompassing, where it can be cruel, but is at least as often indifferent, and where every white person in the country is bound up in it and privileged by it, whether they want to be or not, and will never, ever experience it themselves, where it's not about feelings, but about power. How often do they say, oh, maybe the definition I grew up with was simplified for 9-year-olds? Or, oh, maybe the definition given to me by white grown-ups was less complete than one a black grown-up might have given? And how often do they say, you can't just redefine racism? Right out the gate, the white moderate is possessive not just of their whiteness, but of the very definition of racism. In the definition they know, racism exists only over here. And the white collaborator is a compatriot who shares their ultimate vision for the future and is simply gone off course somewhere. And they don't see themselves as flawed individuals with a long way still to go. They've already arrived. They're the destination everyone else needs to get to. Living proof that white supremacy can be easily and painlessly opted out of. They can't see collaborators as opponents because there is no definition of white supremacy that includes collaborators and doesn't also include them. And this is critically important. They don't want to start thinking of themselves as white. They don't want the constant awareness of one's race and how one's race is perceived. You know, the things the rest of humanity deals with.
But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.